Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Highland Branch Royal Aeronautical Society webinar, where we have Chris Birks, Emma Henderson and Colin McGregor of the Fresson Trust, who are going to tell us the incredible story of Captain Ted Fresson and his exploits as a pioneer of aviation, including connecting the islands to the mainland by air. My name is Kirsty Adam, and on behalf of the Highland Branch Committee, I'm pleased to welcome Society members, friends of the branch, and also those joining us for the first time. I'm really interested to know where people are joining us from tonight, so please use the Q&A tab to say hello and tell us where you are from. Throughout the presentation, I invite you to ask questions through this Q&A tab and vote in support of questions which others have already posted. We will strive to reply to your questions during the talk, but I will then put your questions over to Chris, Emma and Colin in the Q&A session at the end. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm delighted to pass you over to our first guest speaker, Chris Birks.
Thank you, Kirsty. Well, good evening, everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this story from the Fresson Trust about an early aviation pioneer, Captain Ernest Edmund Fresson, OBE, more widely known as Ted. Emma, Colin and I hope to give you a flavour of the fascinating and inspiring life of this intrepid aviator, engineer and businessman. I will give a brief overview of his life, where he flew from in Inverness, and talk about the aircraft he flew. Colin and Emma will then highlight some of the more notable stories. But first of all, who are we? Well, as I said, I am Chris Birks, and I served 30 years in the Royal Air Force, flying primarily Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft, and I retired from the service as a group captain in 2007 after commanding Royal Air Force Kinloss. I joined the Air Force through the University of London Air Squadron in 1977, and after graduating in 1979, trained as a fast jet pilot, but lost my single seat medical category at Lossiemouth, flying Jaguars in '83. So I then retrained on multi-engine aircraft and ended up at Kinloss flying Nimrods with 206 Squadron in 1985. I served also on 120 Squadron and commanded both 201 Squadron from 1998 to 2001, and then, as I said, Kinloss, that was 2004 to 2006. I was also lucky enough to be a Nimrod display pilot in both 1990 and 94, and unlucky enough to have done some staff tours in the Ministry of Defence and at Group Headquarters. Since 2007, I have been a civilian pilot flying business jets for a private airline, NetJets, currently flying a fantastic aircraft, the Bombardier Challenger 350, and our area of operation is around Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. In 2008, I became a trustee of the Fresson Trust, and I am now the secretary and a member of the disbursement committee. But enough of me, over to Colin.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Colin McGregor, and I served in the RAF as a Tornado GR4 pilot for 25 years. I started my flying career with a flying scholarship, which I completed at Dundee, aged 17. And then following my degree at Edinburgh University, where I was a member of the East Lowlands University Air Squadron, I went through officer and flying training before being posted to RAF Lossiemouth on 617 Squadron. I remained at RAF Lossiemouth for my whole flying career, becoming a qualified weapons instructor and flying numerous operational tours in the Gulf, and also doing a display season in 2002. And then after retiring from the RAF in 2007, I spent 7 years as a training captain for Eastern Airways, flying the SAB 2000, and I flew many of the routes that Fresson had pioneered. I finally joined BAE Systems as a Typhoon simulator instructor in 2015. So I'm back based at RAF Lossiemouth again, and 2 years ago I was invited to join the Fresson Trust as a trustee. So I'll now hand over to Emma.
Good evening, everyone. Well, I'm obviously considerably younger than both Chris and Colin, but nowhere near as cool because I didn't actually join the Air Force, although I did start my flying career on the University Air Squadron also. I had a big gap of about 8 years, during which time I married and had my family. And whilst on a military posting, because my husband is in the military out to New Zealand, I resumed my flying training and ended up working for EasyJet, where I eventually became a captain until I took voluntary redundancy in September last year. I founded a charity, Project Wingman, last March, which some of you may be aware of because I presented on it a couple of months ago, and some of you may already also be involved in that. And as well as the Fresson Trust, which I joined at the same time as Colin 2 years ago, I also sit on a number of other trusts and charities, including the local tennis club and various other things around the area as well. So I sit on the disbursement committee, also with Dave and Colin, with Chris and Colin, sorry. And I also help with social media and our Facebook page and website. So I'm going to hand back over to Chris now. He is going first tonight with the Fresson story. I hope you all really enjoy it, and I'll speak to you all again soon.
Well, thank you, Emma. We go back one, thank you. So before talking about the man himself, what is the Fresson Trust? The Trust keeps alive the spirit and memory of Ted Fresson. Around the Highlands and Islands, we place statues and memorials at various airports, and we support various Scottish aviation museums. We also provide modest financial grants to young people from the north of Scotland and wider area aspiring to aviation careers. Currently, we are also forming partnerships with the Highlands and Islands Airports Limited to provide small financial grants to their apprentices, and also with the new Moray Advanced Aerospace Technology and Innovation Centre to help preserve the spirit of Ted Fresson in a local aviation enterprise, and ultimately to assist financially with their apprentices. Locally, we also have a display in the Moravia Museum at Kinloss and at Inverness Museum. But now let's move on to the man himself. Ted Fresson's life is a tale of great adventure, pioneering aviation and entrepreneurship from the early 20th century. But he was born in the 19th century in 1891, so his legacy now spans 3 centuries. A young man initially living in England, Ted was fascinated by the pioneering aviators of the time. In his early days as a teenager and a young man, he spent a lot of time experimenting with his own model aircraft after watching the earliest pioneers trying to fly. And remember too, at this time, no one really understood the principles of flight. They were still developing them or learning them. He was also fascinated by the aviation competitions of the time. £10,000 prizes for the first person to fly a heavier than air machine from London to Manchester or around Britain. It was a time of many first events in aviation, and Ted was to continue that theme. His model making saw him working till midnight after a day's work and getting up at 6 AM to try and fly his models. It took 6 months before he actually made one that flew. Although he was destined for an engineering career in China, he never lost his fascination for flying, and he hoped to learn and fly and fight for his country during World War I. But unfortunately, he was initially ill with typhus, and then he was told his job was too important for him to join up. But eventually he managed to persuade the authorities to let him do so, and he joined up in 2017. He eventually persuaded the authorities to let him join up in 1917, and he travelled from China to learn to fly in Canada, transported by ship then under the constant threat of submarine attack to the United Kingdom, and flew coastal patrols along the North Sea coast, and then he was an instructor. In 1919, after the war, he returned to China and formed his own aircraft company, selling aircraft to Chinese regional governors, but were in fact actually warlords. But against stiff competition from German and French companies and a poor political situation, compounded by the loss of his first wife to typhus, he returned home in 1928 and started to fly joyriders around the UK. And then he discovered Orkney, developed an airport at Widderford, now known as Kirkwall Airport. And he started Highland Airways, which ran in various guises from 1933 to 1948. If we could have the next slide, please. Flying the first fare-paying air travellers in the north of Scotland between Inverness, Wick and Kirkwall, and then later to Shetland. He also delivered the Scotsman newspaper to the islands, so it arrived on the day it was printed. In 1934, he also started the first ever UK airmail service, and he pioneered the first tarmac runways. You see Widderford on the slide and an information board and a memorial that the Trust has had located there. But in 1948, aviation was nationalised by the government and he lost management of his company. Ted left Scotland and went to work for Taylor's Brewery in Kenya, but still did some aviation work before returning in 1955 to run the Downwall filling station and run air charters. He died in 1963 and is buried in Tomnahurrick Cemetery. But as a pioneer, I said earlier that Ted Fresson achieved some notable firsts. Perhaps his greatest was to gain the first ever UK airmail contract at land postal rates, which commenced from Inverness to Orkney on the 29th of May 1934. Instead of a horse and cart from town or village to ferry at Orkney and a sea crossing, if the weather allowed it, and then train or car to Inverness, or the route in reverse, Ted Fresson was able to carry the mail to and from Inverness in just over an hour each way. His first flight to Orkney carried over 2,000 letters. The return carried 12,000. The Post Office Director of Services of the day, General Sir Frederick Williamson, inaugurated the service at a formal ceremony at Inverness Aerodrome and praised Ted's bulldog spirit in achieving such a milestone in history. And in fact, on some days, they just had to mount airmail flights alone without passengers, such was the demand. And various airmail covers have been generated over the years to commemorate this historic event, and you see the very first one on the slide. But General Williamson also presented an airmail pennant that was attached to the flagstaff at Inverness Aerodrome and a miniature pennant for the aircraft. You see the original aerodrome pennant here. Now, if you have travelled through Inverness Airport, you'll have seen Ted's statue by the baggage carousel in the terminal. However, that airport location is not where Ted's original airfield was. He flew from the Longmont Industrial Estate, now named the Fresson Business Park, between the river and the city centre. You see it here, adjacent to the Moray Firth, along Stadium Road, just past the Cally Thistle football ground, which is marked here on this map as a golf course. The airfield was formally opened by the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland on the 17th of June 1933, after Ted had started his airline operations. I took this photo in 2009 on the 75th commemorative airmail flight from a Dragon aircraft, and you can see between the river and the bridge to the right of the photo what is now the business park. Fresson relied greatly on McRae and Dick, the car firm, which initially greatly assisted as a major investor in his company, and then very practically on a daily basis assisted with engineering issues and lighting for the airfield. The lighting was basically shining car lights at night onto the airfield to allow him to see to operate. And from the ground today, on Stadium Road, by the former Inverness Courier Office of what is still the Magnet Trade Warehouse, there is a commemorative stone memorial describing the first flight on the 8th of May in the Monospar aircraft registered Golf Alpha Charlie Echo Whiskey to Wick and Kirkwall, pioneering scheduled air services in the north of Scotland, also stating that this was the Inverness Aerodrome site from 1933 to 1947. Now, his first aircraft was the Monospar, one of the few monoplanes of its day, and the DH-84 Dragon, both of which you can see in pencil form here. The Monospar itself, he first operated Golf Alpha Charlie Echo Whiskey that had been christened Inverness. It took 5 passengers and about 70 pounds of newspapers. However, he had only one. And unfortunately, he crashed it at Orkney at the end of June 1933 and had to rapidly look for a replacement, which was the DH-84 Dragon. This was a biplane and could take more load and later radios. 2 years later, he then operated the DH-89 Dragon Rapide. The Rapide had both radios and more powerful engines, as well as a higher load capacity. However, the issue with these aircraft was that they had only the technology of the day, which was very, very little compared to today, and very little to cope with bad weather. Fresson's exceptional flying and his ability to hire the right calibre of pilots is what allowed them to continue flying and make the service work in poor weather conditions, and when under threat of German aircraft and warships during World War II, as well as misidentification by Allied ships. To help with his navigation, Ted eventually persuaded the Air Ministry during the 1930s to locate direction-finding radio equipment at his airfields, which helped greatly, but unfortunately this was withdrawn during the war years. Now, an early aircraft he flew when joyriding and looking for suitable landing areas was the de Havilland Gypsy Moth, Golf Alpha Alpha Whiskey Oscar, affectionately known as ARWO. This aircraft still flies today. Although rebuilt, its original engine is still installed. It was flown to Orkney in 2008 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the first scheduled flight from Inverness to Wick and then Kirkwall, and again in 2011. On both occasions, Ted's son Richard, who lives today in Findhorn, was a passenger. I was lucky enough to fly in this aircraft in 1982, as it was then owned and still is by Nigel Reed, a friend I traded with in the Royal Air Force. And he, along with Nigel, who is now a British Airways pilot, in 1983, I met with Ted's widow Gwen to hear how she and Ted had survived a crash in 1931 near Leek, Staffordshire in this aircraft before they were married. The aircraft actually landed on top of Gwen and covered her with fuel. When Nigel asked what had happened, she answered, "Well, my dear, the clouds got lower and the mountains got higher and we hit them. That's what happened in those days." Luckily, both survived, and Gwen obviously forgave Ted because she subsequently married him. And here you see ARWO still flying today, 90 years after it crashed. I hope I have given you a flavour of Ted Fresson's achievements. He had an adventurous and inspiring life, and throughout he showed determination, spirit, enthusiasm and fortitude in the face of many obstacles. There are many more stories and detail about the man, and I will now hand over to Colin, who will tell you a bit about them.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris has given us a flavour of Fresson's work here in the Highlands. I want to look now at what influenced Fresson to turn him into this pioneering aviator. And there are a few factors, I think. The first being the era that he was born into. He was born, as Chris has mentioned, in 1891. And when he was 12, the Wright brothers flew their first ever paired flight at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina on December the 17th, 1903. I was lucky enough on my basic flying training with the RAF to go to Kitty Hawk, although we recreated this flight in hang gliders off the sand dunes, which was quite something. So that was the first thing. Think of the technological advances that were going on around him. The motor car was in its infancy. Aviation was at its inception, but making rapid progress. Blériot had crossed the channel in 1909. And then he saw his first ever live airplane fly in 1910, and he was hooked. Here's Blériot's actual aircraft in the Shuttleworth collection, and it actually still flies. And when in the Royal Flying Corps, he even witnessed the birth of the RAF, and when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service combined in April 1918. Although he wrote that it actually didn't change anything. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I believe, was his travel, which was extraordinary, really, for somebody of his age. As Chris mentioned, he initially worked for a tea merchants company who also ran an export engineering business, and they trained him up for a job in China. And he left for China in November 1911, when he was just 20 years old. He went through via Berlin, Warsaw, Moscow, Vladivostok via the Great Manchurian Railway. And the journey took a month via rail and steamboat. When he arrived in China, there were no roads, so frequently would just walk 20 miles a day to get to work. He was there for 5 years, avoided the initial draft for World War I, as Chris has mentioned. But when he was finally drafted, he returned to the UK via Honolulu, where he learned to surf, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Vancouver, then taking a train to Toronto before boarding a ship to Liverpool in January 1918. Quite an incredible journey, I think you'll agree, for somebody quite so young and with international and transcontinental travel at such an infancy. The third factor, I think, is his exposure to life and death situations and how he dealt with risk. And this will obviously become apparent when you think of how he was flying long distances in all weathers across remote areas and often over the sea in single engine biplanes with no radio and no navigation aids. He had several brushes with death, some from illness. In China, he was struck down with typhoid fever and he nearly died. And then he spent some of the war grounded due to Spanish flu and malaria. And on his return to China after the war, his young wife at the time also contracted typhoid, but she wasn't quite so lucky and tragically died from it, leaving him with a 3-month-old daughter. He also survived 2 quite incredible incidents in China. In those days, China was ravaged by civil wars with different factions vying for supremacy. And while taking a 1,100-mile train journey to visit a client, he was sleeping in a hotel next to the railway station, waiting for his next connection, when he was awakened by what he describes as utter pandemonium. Heavy machine gun fire, mortars, people screaming and shouting in fear. As he got out of bed to investigate, his window shattered and his room was peppered with bullets. He grabbed his pillow and blanket and dived under his bed, and he then heard running and crunching of heavy feet and the cries of hotel guests being dragged from their rooms and taken outside. The executions began with political prisoners being beheaded on the street. His bedroom door suddenly burst open and he could see heavy boots stomping across the floor. Luckily, the soldier didn't look under the bed, and satisfied that the room was empty, the soldier left. Ted Fresson lay under the bed for the rest of the night, and next morning, with all quiet, he ventured outside to find bodies lying everywhere in the street. Raids like this were commonplace, so much so that his train still departed on time later that morning as if nothing had happened. His second brush from death in China was when he avoided being narrowly avoided being executed by a Chinese warlord who'd asked him to demonstrate an airplane to his followers. The aircraft was parked upwind, so that meant that Fresson had to taxi to the far end to take off into wind. But the warlord thought that this ground-borne zigzagging aircraft had failed and so felt humiliated. He then ordered his men to execute Fresson on his return. But luckily, Fresson got airborne to the delight of the warlord, and all was forgiven. So I believe that all these experiences hardened him and influenced his attitude to risk. Now, Chris has mentioned his pleasure flights around the UK. These were the air shows of the day. But remember, when Fresson brought the airplane to parts of the country, most people had never actually seen an airplane. On his joyriding tours, he'd fly up to a town and look for a suitable airfield to land. He was then usually surrounded by fascinated people who wanted to touch the plane to see if it was actually real. He'd then give them a quick flying display, and you'll know that it's called barnstorming, before taking paying passengers up for a quick flight, and he'd often do many flights in a day. During 1 month of pleasure flying in Kirkwall, Wick and Thurso, he flew 555 takeoff and landings and carried 1,100 passengers. There are lots of barnstorming flights involving very low passes and flying that you just wouldn't get away with today. And there's a very famous story of him taking a woman on one of his displays from Nairn. During one of his manoeuvres, he was going to fly down Findhorn Beach at low level before pulling up into a loop. When he was doing this, he heard screams coming from his passenger in the front, and she wasn't even strapped in. Another story I really like is, it could have been actually the inspiration for a Top Gear challenge of today. While on one of his barnstorming tours in 1931, a young man who had a sports car, who was staying in the same hotel as Fresson in Granton, made him a wager that he would beat him to Nairn if Fresson gave him a 30-minute head start. So Fresson agreed, and the race duly started at 11 AM the next morning, with the car heading off first. 30 minutes later, Fresson took off and, having climbed to 2,000 feet, could see the Murray coast, so there was no need for a compass. Fresson caught up with the car 3 miles south of Nairn, and he was on the ground for a few minutes when the car arrived. Of course, many of these towns didn't approve of the flying particularly on a Sunday, and he got into bother many times with complaints such as this one. And they were commonplace. So I think that the experiences of his birth as birth of aviation as a young boy, then as a young man traveling around the world, hardened him and gave him the determination to succeed. He also had the vision to see how aviation could change the way we live and work. He came up against many people, particularly in the Highlands, who didn't share his vision, but his perseverance and grit soon changed their mind, and his ventures soon began to reap rewards. I'm now going to hand over to Emma.
Thank you, Colin. I really love the story of the passenger screaming at the top of the loop because she wasn't strapped in. And I must admit, every time I drive down into Findhorn, it does make me giggle at the thought that that would even be allowed then, let alone that it could have happened. During his barnstorming years, Fresson discovered that not only was there a need for the Highlands and Islands to be connected by air, but also that the people of the north of Scotland, and particularly Orcadians, who, with one or two exceptions such as the ferry operators, were really keen to embrace the idea of flying. In the early 1930s, with the backing of the Scotsman newspaper, Macrae and Dick motor engineers, Dr. Alexander of Elgin, and various other businessmen, Fresson established Highland Airways. On the 9th of May 1933, the airline's inaugural flight took off from Longman Airfield in Inverness, heading for Orkney via Wick. The flight was made with much fanfare in a twin-engined monospar aircraft, Golf Alpha Charlie Echo Whiskey, which had been named Inverness, as Chris mentioned earlier. And this was christened by having a bottle of whiskey smashed over one of its propellers, which I thoroughly approve of. The flight to Wick took 50 minutes, and after a 15-minute break, Fresson and his passengers and cargo flew onto Orkney, which took an hour and 15 minutes. And just to give you an idea, when I was an instructor flying out of Inverness, it would take probably just a little bit under that to fly up in like a Cessna 152 type aircraft. So probably a similar amount of time. But when you think how quickly you can get to places by air today, that was breathtakingly fast for then, but obviously seemingly slow for now. But you need to remember as well that most journeys then were taken by train and then steamship. People still used horse and traps, and motorcars were very expensive, very rare, and had a top speed of around 40 miles an hour, which might be quite a good idea around some of the roads at the moment. Now, Golf Alpha Charlie Echo Whiskey actually suffered an unfortunate incident some months later when Fresson landed it in a field in foggy conditions. He did really well. He managed to actually land the aircraft, but he managed to rip the engines off the wings by rolling out into the only hole in an otherwise perfect landing field. And the future of the air service provided by Fresson was hanging in the balance. Did he give up in despair? Well, he could have done. But and he probably felt like it, but he didn't. He just borrowed a plane and a pilot from a friend he had who was operating down in Glasgow named John Sward, and the air service continued without much of a hitch. Now, Highland Airways went from strength to strength during those pre-war years, and in fact, the service was so reliable and so regular that the Scotsman increased its investment, and the Post Office commissioned Highland Airways, as Chris mentioned, to be the UK's first airmail service, which is one that still continues today. And as Chris also said earlier, Fresson added larger aircraft to his fleet, starting with the de Havilland Dragon, then the larger Rapide, and also expanded his airline to provide services from Aberdeen to Shetland. In fact, he was the first to fly from Dice Airfield, which you will know better as Aberdeen Airport. He didn't continue operating from Dice for very long because there was a competitor named Gander Dower who started operating there and actually was so competitive he basically drove Fresson away. All the time, Fresson himself was a full-time, hands-on working pilot. And I actually had the huge pleasure today to speak to one of his surviving engineers, a man named Ted Mackenzie, who lives in Inverness. And I'm going to have a longer chat with him on Friday morning to find out some more of Fresson's tales. But Fresson himself went to extreme lengths to complete each flight. On one occasion, he was asked to carry a passenger from Orkney back to the mainland, but his aircraft was completely full of mail. He agreed to carry the passenger, but they had to lie on top of the mail sacks for the entire flight. I'm sure there are some low-cost airlines that would think that's an excellent idea today, but I think it would be just as frowned upon today as it would have been if anyone had known about it at the time. Another time, and actually with the same passenger, he was flying above cloud and found a hole to dip down through so he could just basically work out where he was. He found the railway line which ran from Wick to Inverness and a station coming up ahead. So he said to his passenger, you know, if I bring the plane down low enough, will you read the name of the station? It was Fern Station, just north of Tain. And they were making good progress along their route. But can you imagine the trouble you'd be in, not to mention the paperwork, if you were to do that today? I'm fairly sure that would definitely be going within 500 feet of a person, vehicle or building. So there's no doubt that the kind of flying undertaken by Fresson and his fellow pilots in those days was so far removed from flying today, even in light aircraft, but that it is almost unrecognisable. Almost, but not quite, because actually he faced huge challenges throughout his career, which actually when we originally gave this presentation a couple of years ago, we couldn't have imagined, but now it seems so much closer to home, doesn't it? There was no such thing then as instrument flying, and when they couldn't see where they were going, perhaps because of the hull rolling in, they basically just winged it, which led to some hilarious and hair-raising accounts, which you can read about in the book of Fresson's memoirs, which I'll talk about later on. When World War II broke out, all the Rapides were camouflaged, and Fresson dutifully signed up and had been given call-up papers, but these were almost immediately cancelled because the work he was doing running and operating an airline was considered to be so important that he was told to continue it as war work. The air service between Inverness and the islands continued in all weathers throughout the entire war, and there were encounters with enemy aircraft even up here in the Moray Firth and further north in the Pentland Firth and on Orkney. On one occasion, while waiting for takeoff in very low cloud at RAF Sunborough, a Heinkel made a low pass and shot up all the aircraft on the flight line. Fresson decided that rather than wait around as a sitting target, he would take his chances and took off into the cloud. In fact, in order to hide from enemy aircraft, they always flew just above the clouds so they could dip down into it, or just above the ground so they were camouflaged. Rather them than me, I think, and I'm not sure the passengers that I used to carry would have been entirely happy with that anyway. Of course, Highland Airways wasn't the only one operating. Times were moving fast and the demand for air transport was growing and growing, and in 1935 Highland Airways was taken over by United Airways and became Scottish Airways, and later that year this became a subsidiary of the newly formed British Airways Limited. Fresson's story has a bit of a sad ending because after the Second World War, all UK airlines, including Scottish Airways, were merged and nationalised under the name of BEAC, and the founders of the individual airlines who contributed so much to air travel in the UK and around the world were one by one dismissed. Fresson received 1 year's salary, which was about £2,000 then and equates to roughly £80,000 today, as severance, and never received any further compensation, although his friend and rival Gander Dower, who had successfully run Allied Airways in Aberdeen, fought for compensation, and the final payment for that was only made as recently as 1973. And be careful about saying that was a long time ago because it was the year I was born, so clearly not very long ago at all. Saddened by the way he had been treated, Fresson left the UK to run a brewery in Nairobi, as Colin mentioned, in Kenya, although he did still fly, and he didn't return to Scotland until the late 1950s. And like so many trailblazing aviators, he died in relative obscurity in Inverness in 1963, aged 72. After the nationalisation, air travel continued in the Highlands and Islands, but on a greatly reduced scale. And it wasn't until the founding of Loganair in 1962 that these returned to their Fresson days. Very little is left of the airline Fresson started. The hangars at Longman Airfield, or the Longman Industrial Estate as it is now, were demolished in 2014. The Gypsy Moth is still flying, and Fresson's first and favourite Dragon survived and is in a museum. Captain Fresson made such a large contribution to pioneering aviation, not only establishing the air link between Inverness and the islands, but also carrying airmail, the newspaper, the air ambulance, and establishing airports in Inverness, Aberdeen, Wick, Kirkwall, Stornoway and Sombra. And he also advised the Air Ministry on the location of airfields during the Second World War, including Dalcross, which obviously became the Inverness airport we know and love today. For his efforts, he was awarded an OBE in 1943 for his work as managing director of the wartime Scottish Airways. So it's really the legacy that has been left behind, the airfields, the air ambulance, airmail and the network that still connects Inverness and the islands today. The Fresson Trust was set up to remember Ted Fresson and his outstanding achievements by the management team of Highlands and Islands airports, and as well as family members and representatives of one of the major shareholders of the original Highland Airways. Its aim is to further knowledge of aviation in the Highlands and Islands, particularly to young people, and that includes providing financial assistance to anyone looking to pursue a career in or around aviation, and that's not necessarily limited to just being a pilot. This might be funding a Class 1 medical or paying for ATPL ground school exams, but as I said, it's not limited to that. And there are apprenticeships in engineering and all sorts of other things surrounding aviation that certainly at the moment might be a little bit of a safer bet than pilot training. It's really worth remembering that aviation is a much wider body of people than pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, people servicing the instruments we use to fly in and out of airports and things like that. They're all part of the aviation network and all valid parts and just as important in their own right. And we were recently very delighted to present a talk with the air cadets in Inverness. It was, I say recently, it was actually a couple of years ago now, where Chris Reed, who was one of our award recipients, was able to join us. So I hope you have enjoyed this story and our own as well, and found them interesting and inspirational. And if you would like to read more about the Fresson story, there is a book, and it's called Air Road to the Isles, and it's written by Ted Fresson originally, rewritten. The very original version was written by him, but it was rewritten a bit later on to bring it up to date after the kind of the fallout of the nationalisation of the airlines. You can buy a hard copy of the book for £25 by contacting us directly. But you can also find it on Amazon as a digital version on Kindle. It's full of loads of the Fresson stories, which are frankly hilarious. It can be quite a heavy going read at times, but it's really worth it because there are so many funny stories, shocking stories, and really sometimes quite unbelievable, but they are true stories. And I've had the pleasure also of talking to Ted's son Richard, who really brings these stories to life, and I'm hoping to speak more to him in the future to capture some of them that we'd like to share with you again in the future. So if you have had any questions that have come up during our talk, now would be the chance to answer them. Chris, Colin and myself will all be available to answer questions. I hope you've enjoyed what we've said this evening, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris, Emma and Colin, for that fantastic presentation, giving us all an insight onto the life and achievement of Captain Ted Fresson. Thank you also to the audience we've got one great question at the minute, which I'll go on to now, but you do have time to submit any more questions. So we have one question that's, what brought Ted, a boy from Surrey who built aircraft in China, to Inverness?
Well, I'll crack off on this one, Kirsty. As you heard from the story, he came back from China, and he was really at a loss of what to do, because he'd set up his airframe building business in China, and he wanted to continue in the UK. And so he started barnstorming and joyriding, and it was that really took him to the north of Scotland. He eventually ended up with his own barnstorming company. And every year they'd fly all around the Highlands, scouting out different places to go and fly. And that's what took him to Orkney. And when he got to Orkney, he just fell in love with the place and the welcome that the people gave him. And he realised that there was an opportunity to set up a business which was really a game changer for the people of the islands, initially in Orkney and then in Shetland, by connecting them rapidly with the main city centres of population for the north, such as Inverness and Aberdeen. So it was really his barnstorming took him to Scotland. He fell in love with the area, with the people up here, and he saw a business opportunity, and he eventually persuaded people to actually go along with him on that, because as Emma mentioned, there were some people who didn't want him to start air services, in particular the ferry companies. But having got on side, first of all, the newspapers in terms of the Scotsman and Macrae and Dick, he then actually persuaded the steamship companies that it would be worthwhile working with him too. And that all of that managed to keep him up in the Highlands.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. We have someone else asking, so contracts to carry mail-propelled developments of aviation in the United States to a great extent, how key was the Royal Mail to Fresson's business? So would you have been able to have a success from the businesses, from passengers and other freight without a steady income?
I think the answer is yes, because he was doing that for a year before he actually had the mail contract. His steady income to begin with that really helped him get everything going was the newspaper contract, which he started with the first scheduled air services in May 1933. And the post office, although it was a great boost to his business, didn't start until 1934. I don't know if Emma or Colin have anything to add to that.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is that when he first started carrying paying passengers, it was really just as a favour initially, and he suddenly realised as a result of this there were salesmen that travelled all over the country, and their only link to the islands was to either take a long ferry journey, which didn't always run in bad weather, but Fresson could get them there in minutes really, and that was a really valuable service that I agree with Chris, he absolutely would have been able to continue with. But actually the airmail service and the air ambulance service that he provided as well were all just as vital. And you'll know as well, many airlines today don't just carry passengers, a lot of them carry freight and airmail as well, so it's continued to be something that is shared in terms of payload.
I should also add there was some fierce competition and he did survive. There was Gandadower, who Emma mentioned, at Aberdeen. Perhaps a trick Ted missed was when I said earlier he had the direction finding equipment put in place at his airports. That was on condition he allowed other airlines to use them, which immediately gave Gandadower the opportunity to fly also from Aberdeen to Shetland and various other places, whereas Gandadower wouldn't put direction finding equipment in at Dice, so Ted couldn't fly there. But so you can see there's a fair bit of competition between the companies, but there was room for all of them, and Ted found other airfields on the coast at Aberdeen and also nearer to Inverness to continue. So that because it was such a game changer, I think, in this area of the world to move rapidly, it was that's why the company continued. And there were also charter air services too. He never really established an airfield despite identifying an area at Stornoway until just before the war. And when when the council in Stornoway agreed for him to site it, World War II came along and the military took it over. So I think there was plenty beyond the airmail service to keep Ted going.
Brilliant, thank you. That's really interesting. They're asking, is it known if Ted and Ernest K. Gann crossed paths?
Ted and?
Ernest K. Gann.
Are we thinking of Gandadower or?
I'm thinking Gandadower.
Oh, I think so. And yes, they did. And although they were competitors, they actually still remain friends, Richard has told me as well, in the post-war years.
Ernest K. Gann was, quick Google here on my part. Ernest K. Gann was a American pilot, actually. And as far as I know, they didn't cross paths, as it happens. Gandadower was, as Chris said, his rival in Aberdeen. But the short answer to that would be no, they didn't cross paths to our knowledge.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have someone here he was an ATCO at SCATSA, and he's saying hi to Colin there. And he now works for Highlands and Islands Airport Limited. And he's asking, are you aware that the new Highlands and Islands Airport Limited location for the ATMS, that's remote towers, is to be based at New Century House, which is directly opposite the Fresson Memorial. So is it going to be the main ATC location for Highlands Islands Airport Limited? I was wondering if it could be renamed as Fresson House as a link to the past and a perfect memorial to this great man.
I knew that the air traffic was being remoted. I wasn't aware of exactly where it was, and now we have that information. I'm sure we can start to make a case for it.
Definitely. I think we should definitely be pushing for that.
Yeah, great. So I think that's everything we have right now. Any other final questions? In that case, that is the end of our Q&A session. Once again, thanks to our speakers and also our audience for getting involved. And of course, to the production team who have been busy behind the scenes running this event. You will be able to watch this talk again using the link which you used to join the event. And a copy will also be posted to the Royal Aeronautical Society's YouTube channel. If you'd like to stay informed about Highland Branch activities, please do join our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. You'll find links for these in the Q&A tab. I look forward to welcoming you to future Highland Branch events. Our next event is going to be with David Oxley, and that's on the space industry in the Highlands Islands. That will be on Thursday, the 9th of September, so be sure to add that into your diaries. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. I truly hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as I did. Good night.